everyone, welcome. I'm the moderator today. My name is Sebastian Ogimstra. I'm a senior fellow at Erasmus University Rotterdam, and I'm also related to an international law firm here in Luxembourg. Today we will speak about pan-European pensions and tontines, and more specifically whether Europe can take a lead in the global discussion. In the goodbye speech of Bernardino, he indicated already that occupational pensions, and more specifically the pan-European occupational pensions, would be one of the major topics to address after he would leave. And in this respect, we have in this webinar two speakers which are very distinguished and knowledgeable in the pan-European pension domain, and especially in this forthcoming discussion. And at the one hand, we have Francesco Briganti, who is Secretary General at CBVA Europe. It's an association which is representing all types of constituencies in Europe. And he will discuss about his proposal of improving the pan-European occupational pensions. And at the other hand, we have Dean McClelland. He is CEO at Tontine Trust with the revolutionary Tontine business model. He is currently rolling out a pan-European pension product, also referred to as the PEP. And together with them, we will do the webinar. So how will it work? First, Francesco will introduce his pan-European occupational pension idea. And then we'll pose some questions. If you want to pose any questions, feel free to drop them in the message box, and I will try to pick upon them if it is possible within the time frame. Afterwards, Dean will give his 15-minute presentation, and then we will have a plenary session. And I hope again to incorporate some of your comments. The floor is for you, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And so I prepared some slides so that you can have an idea on this PEOP project. I hope you can see that. Yeah. Do you see the slides?
Yes, perfect. Yes, very clearly.
Thank you very much. So let's start with this presentation. So a PEOP stands for Pan-European Occupational Pension. And so here we can start speaking a little bit about the cross-border pensions in Europe according to the current regulation. Actually, there are two possibilities at the moment so far to have cross-border pensions in Europe. The first is the PEP. The PEP is a personal pension product. It is created at European level, so it's a kind of federal European pension vehicle. And this is seems to be, at least according to the legislation, quite efficient, because it will act basically under the same conditions across the different EU member states. And it is it will be fully portable. Then instead for the workplace pensions, so basically the occupational pensions, we have the so-called IORP directive. The IORP directive is quite different because first of all, the pension funds are only national entities, so they are, unlike the PEP, are national pension vehicles. And there are some issues, because when there are cross-border activities with the IOPs, it's mandatory to comply at least with the two legislations. One is the legislation of the country where the pension fund is based, which is called the home country. And then there is the legislation of the country where the company and the employees are based. So it's called the host country, and the portability is not granted. You can see here a little bit how, if you put in the center the country where the pension fund, in the case of cross-border activity of IOPS, is based, so country A in the center, and then you can see that around there are different compartments, because so in the countries B, C, D, and so on. Imagine that country A is Belgium, and then the other countries are Germany, Italy, Ireland, whatever. You can see that there are different jurisdictions to comply with. And this, of course, might create some complications. And you can see a little bit here the list of the critical issues of the cross-border activities provided by the IOP directive, in particular the compliance with the social and labor regulation of the host state, the taxation for sure, but also I would say there is another problem which is very practical, but it is very widespread. It is the notification procedure. So basically, the pension fund which decides to set up a cross-border activity needs to get for sure. Excuse me, someone is my voice is coming back. Notification procedures. So sorry, no problems. So a notification means that the different national authorities must grant the notification, and sometimes this procedure takes a long time, and there are sometimes also different requests. So why don't we go beyond the cross-border activities of the IOP directive, and we do create a real European framework for a pan-European occupational pension, a little bit like the PEP, but it would be the corresponding workplace version of the PEP. Well, in such a case, we would have for sure some advantages, quite interesting. The first is that the PEOP would really generate huge economies of scale, because there would be a kind of simultaneous compliance. We would avoid the simultaneous compliance with the national legislations, and instead we just would have to follow the European regulation and the requirements from the European regulation. Then we would have the possibility to open up the competition between national pension funds and this European vehicle, especially in those states where, for example, the workplace pensions do not really exist, or where they do exist, but they are very expensive. And so competition in such a case would be beneficial. And another big advantage, it is clear to everyone, a pan-European occupational pension would ease the mobility of workers in the European Union with regards to the acquisition and safeguard of their pension rights. And that would be very interesting, especially for the multinational companies having different branches in Europe. They could easily move their workers from a country to another. And the last, but I would say not least, big advantage would be that such a pan-European occupational vehicle would really foster the financial industry in Europe, because there would be the possibility to create huge pension funds operating in several countries of Europe, and so also basically to generate huge and massive assets to be invested also in the European economy. By the way, this is a big problem in Europe, because apart from probably the Netherlands and maybe a little bit with Britain, which is not even anymore a member of the European Union, our pension funds in Europe are very small, and in general, the assets are fragmented in small pots. So we cannot really compete, for example, with the big countries like the United States or even Canada, Australia, which have much larger pension funds. And then some features about this PEOP. Well, first of all, who might create the PEOP? Either employers, I made the example of multinational companies, of course they could create themselves a PEOP, or pension providers like insurance companies, pension funds, of course, asset managers. In such a case, providers could create also multi-employer PEOPs. In other words, they could create kind of master trusts, and this kind of open PEOPs could be opened so also to, for example, small medium enterprises could join directly these platforms operating at cross-border level. Again, having the advantage maybe of better and lower costs compared to their national products. Then another important feature is that the PEOP would be voluntary and alternative to the existing national pension products, which means that it would cohabit with them, but the national pension funds should not have to comply and to adapt their internal functioning to the PEOP regulation. So basically they would be free to operate as they do today. It's very different from the IOP directive. The IOP directive obliges all the pension funds to adapt their functioning to the European directive. It would not be the case with the PEOP. By the way, it's not the case also with the PEPP, because also the PEPP is a voluntary second regime, we call it in the European legal language. And then, like the PEPP, it would be immediately authorized to operate in the different countries of the European Union. I said before that the procedures to get the authorizations for IOPs to have the authorization to set up cross-border activities in some countries are still very complicated, while instead the PEOP would, as a European product, would have a passport. Basically, they should only inform the PEOPs, the member states where they want to create a local branch, that they are going there. Only information, not really authorization, because it would be automatic. And last, here, I would say that I think from fundamental, it would be fully portable. Not only portable, not only a PEOP would be portable between its national accounts, so within the same PEOP, I could move in many other European countries and always take the money with me, but also if I decide to change, so between PEOPs, I decide to quit my previous PEOP, I decide to join a new PEOP, I could immediately transfer my money to the new PEOP of destination, which is also another huge possibility. And why not, something that we wrote in our reflection paper, also portability could be provided between PEOPs and PEPPs. So could be also would be also a possible channel to improve portability of pensions. Other features of the PEOP, well, first of all, no fee caps. That will be different with a difference with the PEPP, because we imagine that the PEOP, I mean, the market would decide already the costs of the management and investments. So no thresholds are mandatory by the European legislation. We know, by the way, that the thresholds, the fee cap, is still a big problem with the PEPs. The same rules on investing and waiting periods and the treatment of dormant rights in all the European countries where the PEOP would act. And especially for the accumulation phase, the PEOP would have the same rules on investments, governance, capital protection, so basically guarantees or capital protection in other ways, information to the members, the users, but also reporting to the supervisory authorities, same rules, so possibility to work in harmonious way, homogeneous way across the European countries. In terms of solvency rules, we mentioned, like the PEPs, that the solvency rules would be basically the same European rules applied to the different entities that would be enabled to create PEOPs, like the solvency rules for the insurance companies, for asset managers, or for pension funds. And then instead we would have, the PEOP would be flexible for other aspects. So flexible meaning that it could be adaptable to the different member states, the different requirements or preferences of the member states. For example, about the amount of the contributions, I have to remind that it would be a DC, defined contribution pension product. So in terms of contributions, in terms of guarantees on the capital and the investments, that would be a choice to much cover the guarantees. The payout options, of course, in some countries, for example, lump sums are basically the main rule for the payout, but in other countries instead annuities are still preferred. The coverage of biometric risks, and of course the retirement age. So also would be also flexible in other aspects that would not undermine the smooth functioning of the PEOPs during the accumulation phase. Yeah, I have an example. It's a graphical example on how it's an important question, I think, on how the PEOP could cohabit and which kind of relations could have with the national pension products. So if the PEOP, let's say, is the light blue here on the graphic is a PEOP, it could also act, as you can see here. Let's say if we take the state B, in the state B, a PEOP is already covering the occupational pension of that company, of course, for that company, let's say. But in other countries, state B or state C, well, we can have a national occupational pension. How could it interact with the PEOP? It could interact by using, let's say, the PEOP as a corridor just to ensure portability. So, for example, if I am a member of a pension fund based in country A, a national pension of country A, and one day I decide to move to another country, I could join the PEOP with which this pension fund makes an agreement with the PEOP, and I could move together with the PEOP, and of course I could transfer my money through the PEOP to another country. So, I mean, the typical good example would be the example of the member state D. You can see that, take a company. A company might have, let's say, a company which is mainly a Dutch company or an Italian company, and the 80% of workers are based in those countries. So you can see on the layer on the bottom, you can have already your national pension of that company in those countries because the majority of workers are there. But then you have a 20% of workers who are instead located in other countries of the same employer, but in such a case you would create a PEOP, because then you would cover the remaining 20% of your workforce with a PEOP. And even if instead the company has some mobile workers, instead of enrolling them in the national pension fund of that company, it could enroll them already in the PEOP because those workers are very mobile according to the internal organization. So could be also flexible, let's say, and a good tool for portability. The taxation for sure, and I'm closing to the end. The taxation for sure is the most challenging part of in general pensions in Europe, because we know that taxation is not a competence of the European Union unless we reach the unanimity of the member states. Here, the problem of the taxation of the PEOP is not really how much, because I mean every member state could decide how much taxation to apply, and would not be really an issue. The real issue is when the taxation is required. And you know that in the member states, I mean, the taxation basically can fall on the contributions to the pension, on the returns on the investments. Usually it doesn't, but in some countries it also returns are taxed, or on the benefits. In Europe, we know that the most spread formula is the EET formula, so exemption on contributions, exemption on returns, and taxation on benefits. But some countries have a TEE formula, and others, like for example Denmark or Italy, have an ETT formula. And you can imagine that when when we have to adapt the taxation to the different moments of the accumulation or the accumulation phase, you have also a problem to work smoothly across Europe. So ideally speaking, but it's only ideally speaking, an harmonized taxation formula would be the best. I would even prefer the TEE, honestly, because I would imagine that in a TEE system, the taxation on contributions would be immediately paid, but then workers would be free to move to other countries, and basically their, let's say, situation with the local tax authority would be already settled. But as for the moment, that would be quite complicated. We studied a possible alternative, and the possible alternative would be a kind of European centralized agency, a kind of tax agency, a kind of hub. This hub would act as a filter, a filter between the PEOPs and the national tax authorities. Would be very interesting because basically the PEOPs would only interact with this agency, and using this agency as the only interlocutor for their tax issues, then basically they would act as if the taxation formulas was harmonized in Europe, because they do only respond to this agency, and then the agency, of course, would refund the national tax authorities with the money of their own countries. I give you here an image on how it could look like. Maybe you can better understand from this chart. So you can see that on the top there are the national tax authorities. They would interact with this decentralized EU taxation agency here in the center of the graph. And then from the bottom you can see that the PEP, or even the PEP, could use the same agency, or the PEOPs would only interact with the centralized taxation agency. That would be very interesting, because we would not need to change anything in terms of legislation of the tax in Europe. Countries would following and keeping their taxation formulas, but PEOPs and PEPPs would not be undermined by the different taxation formulas. Just the final slide. Well, the final slide, a little bit the state of the art. So where do we stand? CBVA, so the organization that I do represent, CBVA Europe, prepared a reflection paper explaining how the PEOP could look like. It's a first legal study. It's a kind of feasibility study, maybe not so ambitious, but it's still a study. It's 60 pages, so it's quite legal, of course. And we started a campaign. We know, and we are very proud of that not only the European Union is aware of this project, but also last February, the exiting outgoing chair of EIOPA, Mr. Bernardino, clearly stressed the need to have a new European legal framework for a pan-European occupational pension. For us, it was a big endorsement that EIOPA really stresses this need. And the condition for sure, and that's the reason why we are doing the campaign to have the EU starting working on this initiative, is that several stakeholders will support the project. So basically the market appetite for many stakeholders, be them employers, be them providers, advocating for that. And with this regard, CBVA is in fact creating a coalition of stakeholders supporting this idea, stakeholders mainly based in Europe and the United States. And of course, if you are interested in this product, we are sure it will come one day, but to speed up the project, you can of course join our campaign. I thank you very much, and I give you the floor to Sebastian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for your insightful contribution. I think that especially on the point of PEOPs with national occupational pensions, we have some questions of the audience that I would like to pose to you. And although they were posed a bit earlier in your presentation, and I think that one way or the other you touched maybe briefly upon it, I think it's important to pose them. So the first question that we have is whether the PEOP is feasible given the protection of incumbents.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, what we wrote in our paper is that in principle, we have to be very clear. Competition is good. We have to be very clear. Competition is good. So ideally, in those countries where occupational pensions are not mandatory, like for example in the Netherlands, they are mandatory. Collective agreements, sector-wide pension funds, ministry decree of extension to make it compulsory to all the sector. Well, when they are mandatory, the PEOP, of course, could not and should not interfere with the mandatory pension funds of those countries. So that's for us granted. I use the Netherlands as an example because probably it is the most known example of mandatory pension funds. The system works very well. Netherlands has one of the best pension systems of the world. No one, I mean, there is not even need to destroy this system. At the same time, in many other countries, pension funds are not mandatory, are already in competition domestically. So why not? PEOPs could compete with them as well. I mean, if there is a free market, in such a case, PEOPs could also compete with them. And we have to be honest that in some countries, pension funds are not really efficient. They're not really efficient because their costs and fees are very high. They are not very efficient because they are not always very transparent, even if the IOP directly improved this kind of issues. And in other countries, there are not even basically pension funds. If we think about the Central and Eastern European countries, basically there are no occupational pensions. So why not to have PEOPs maybe created in Ireland, maybe created in Belgium, maybe created in France, covering those countries and offering to the local workers occupational pensions. So in short, and to conclude, to answer your question, the relation would be to not interfere on the national systems where the occupational pensions are mandatory, but for all those other, when there is room for competition, then PEOPs for sure should and could compete with the local pensions.
I see there are many questions pouring in for you, Francesco. Maybe to have a really brief one, because we have to be a bit conscious of the time. What is now the status of the PEOP in terms of development?
Well, the state is that the European Union is aware of the project. The EIOPA, like I said before, the outgoing president of EIOPA clearly recommended the need of the European Union to proceed and to start legislation about the pan-European pension, occupational pension, so basically about what we call the PEOP. We did this reflection paper, which is already in the hands of some European authorities. We are sending it out to others. The key is the market appetite. So maybe just to say, the European Union will take seriously into consideration the start of the PEOP, so basically to work on the PEOP, when they will have the feedback from stakeholders that the PEOP is worth it. And that's a key. That's a key. Probably they will have a consultation. There will be probably a consultation one day from the European Union, and they will ask, would you like to have a European legal framework for a pan-European occupational pensions? And of course, the answer should be yes, go ahead with that.
All right, thank you very much, Francesco. I think there are also other questions which are very interesting to address, but I would like now to go ahead with Dean, and then we'll see after the presentation of Dean whether we still have time to answer the other questions. All right, with respect to the presentation of Dean, Dean is the CEO, as introduced before, of Tontine Trust. He is currently rolling out a pan-European pension product, and it is going to be tontine-based. And tontines are a very, very old financial product, the world's most successful ever, but that is something that Dean will address in his presentation. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Sebastian. Actually, Francesco, great presentation. I have about 5 or 6 questions myself that I want to ask, but let me get through our one first. Obviously, the European Commission has done an amazing job of putting together the pan-European personal pension product, which I personally believe sets the new gold standard for pensions, not just in Europe, but across the world. And I think this is a brilliant initiative to be able to bring that level of governance and transparency and, in fact, innovation in pensions to occupational pensions as well as personal pensions. So I think it's a brilliant initiative. And what I'm going to do today is essentially present one of the innovations that PEPP allows, which we are confident that we can easily slot into a pan-European occupational pension so that everybody else can benefit. I can just put the screen up. I trust you can see that okay?
Yes, this is very well visible, Dean.
Okay, great. So obviously, our firm is Tontine Trust, but we're here today to talk about PEOPs. One of the things that PEPP has introduced is that it's opened the door to a next generation of pension funds for innovation. Innovation is not really a word that's associated with the pension sector. In fact, it's usually looked upon with a high degree of mistrust. But the reality is that innovation happens, and PEPP has enabled it in a very, very positive way. But in order for me to explain exactly what PEPs have now enabled, first I'd like to explain the problem that needed to be solved by the pensions industry. And essentially, that problem is that fundamentally, everybody, all employees across Europe, share the same goal. They want to work hard, save money, support their families, and hopefully save enough so that when they get to retirement, they're going to be able to, have a wonderful, relaxing time and, enjoy their golden years. And this is what the pension system is designed to do. Unfortunately, as I found out in 2017, that dream is largely over for most people. The way I found out about this was a very personal way. It happened to be that my mother and her friends revealed that they spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about running out of money in old age if they happen to live a long time. So like any good former investment banker's son, I went out looking to see if there's a solution for the problem. And I started to understand that this is actually a huge problem everywhere in the world. In fact, for savers aged over 55, running out of money in old age is actually now the #1 fear. And that's, this is a situation nobody could have anticipated when DC pensions were launched. Why are they so fearful? Well, currently what people do if they have a DC pension account is that when they reach retirement, they follow something called the 4% rule. And the 4% rule essentially is there to guide you towards making your savings last until you're about 90 years old. The problem with the 4% rule is that if you're a 65-year-old man retiring today, you have a 33% chance of living beyond 90, in which case you have a 33% chance of running out of money. Even worse, if you're a 65-year-old lady, you have a 44% chance of living into your 90s. So clearly the 4% rule is no longer going to work. So multiple private pension providers around the world have carried out studies to try and understand what savers actually want from a pension product if the 4% rule is now obsolete. And what they've invariably found is that 84% of savers, they want an income that lasts a lifetime. They want that income to increase over time so that it rises faster than inflation so that their standards of living doesn't fall. And they want great value for money, which means low fees and a high income for their pension savings. Unfortunately, this study, the main study that was carried out in 2017, the 100 insurers involved agreed that if a product has a defined benefit or a fixed rate of income, it's absolutely impossible to make all the numbers work and deliver all the features that consumers want. However, there's been a huge movement around the world for the last few years, initially started in academia, which has now been championed by policymakers, where they're talking about creating risk-sharing pensions because they enable higher income retirement And by spreading the risk as a collective among savers, it means that you can manage the risk in retirement without the need or expense of a guarantee. So initially, the UK was first to jump on this bandwagon in 2018. More recently, the OECD has come out and talked about the future of pensions, and they have devoted a whole chapter to explaining the advantages of tontines, in that they can offer everybody a higher income in retirement, and they can significantly reduce your risk in retirement by ensuring you don't run out of money. And all of this is possible without the need for a guarantee from an employer or from an insurance company or from a government. But most people in the world, unless you're 200 years old, don't even want to know what a tontine is. So let me give you a quick explanation. Essentially, what we're saying is that we'll get cohorts of a same gender, similar age, for example, such as 60 to 65-year-old ladies. They'll all accumulate their pension funds into a single closed pool. That money is then invested in a highly diversified portfolio. It's not just invested in bonds, it can get exposed to long-term investments, some equities, green bonds. It can have a much more diversified, almost like an endowment fund portfolio, as opposed to the old defined benefit pension systems. Then what happens is that when all these ladies reach the age of 65, they're all going to start receiving a monthly income, which is prorated to their contribution to the original pot. By 20 years later, you've now got less ladies in the pool, but the money is still there, which means that those surviving ladies are now receiving higher incomes in retirement. And then for those ladies that end up living up to 95 or 100 years old, instead of running out of money and ending up on the street, the fund is now liquidating the capital as quickly as possible to return it to the remaining members before they pass away. As a result of all this, means that the income increases over time. It's never going to run out of money. And actually, if you're one of the ladies that lives to be into old age, instead of having something to worry about, you're now having the best healthcare money can buy. Well, when you try and explain a concept like this to people for the first time, they get very confused and they say, well, this sounds a little bit unusual. Would people actually be interested in something like this? Well, historically, tontines were created in, I think, 1653. They were initially launched by the Dutch of all people. And it was the first pan-European pension fund because it spread across the whole continent. And it led Adam Smith to write in The Wealth of Nations that if a government ever wants to, issue a pension product, more money can always be raised by tontines by anything else. But it wasn't the only occasion. A little bit later, the USA read about tontines, about the European tontines, and they imported them and started offering them, and it absolutely transformed the US insurance industry, growing it by 600% within a single generation. So these are blockbuster products that appeal to people. But I guess the big question that everybody has is, what is the nature of this appeal? Why do they always have such a spectacular impact in any market in which they're launched? So if we think about normal pension products, they're not things that people generally get overly excited about. Those that do save in the pensions are probably because they've been opted in as a result of legislation, so they have to contribute, or they're looking to reduce tax, and some of them are even actually planning on saving for retirement, but it's very much driven by law and tax at the moment. If you look at another type of financial product that's in the market, which is a lottery, lotteries have no problem getting people to make voluntary contributions, and nobody is out there complaining that people don't spend enough on lotteries every month. But the reason people put so much money, unfortunately, into lotteries is that they're driven by this behavioral science effect, which is that they overestimate their chances of receiving an outsized reward for their contribution. The thing is, this behavioral science effect is not all negative if we use it correctly, because essentially that's what's happening in a tontine. You've got your regular pension product, which has, which is mandated by law, and it has the various tax advantages, but it also means that you now have this high degree of certainty that if you live into old age, instead of running out of money, actually you're going to benefit to a large degree, and you're going to have an amazing lifestyle in retirement. And this is what has always driven people to save as much as possible into their tontine pensions. So it's interesting for us to try and quantify what is the difference between a tontine PEOP versus, for example, an annuity or following the 4% rule. And the difference is actually quite harsh when you display it graphically. Essentially, the orange line represents the current value of an annuity in Ireland for €1 million. That's what you can expect to receive. If you leave your money in the bank and just draw it down, which many retirees do now, then you can expect to get about $3,000 a month for the rest of your life. But of course, that's going to run out when you reach your 90s. On the other hand, if you pool your money into a tontine, the payments not only start higher than an annuity, and whilst they are variable over time, they tend to vary in a very positive direction as the number of members in the pool passes away. So if we talk about rolling out tontine PEOPs, why would employers want to offer this? Well, essentially what they're saying is to their staff is that we're offering you a lifetime income until age 120. And for the employer, it adds no more costs and certainly no more liability than if they were just offering a DC pension. For the employees, they can expect that income in retirement is going to rise faster than inflation. The fact that the tontine PEOP can invest in a broader spread of assets than just government bonds yielding 0%, and the fact that there's no guarantee required means that there's higher incomes in retirement as a result of better growth in the portfolio. And of course, the beauty of the PEOP is that, as designed, it's going to adhere to the PEPP standards, which means that more or less, that all that governance and transparency that's been mandated by PEPP will now be made available for every worker of any country that's operating across Europe. And I think this is an amazing innovation. So in summary, we feel PEPP has set a new gold standard for personal pensions. Tontines offer the missing lifetime income pension benefit, which is what savers actually want. And on that basis, tontine PEOPs can bring best-in-class protections, benefits, and portability to occupational pensions. And I, for one, will be voting to see this happen. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dean, for introducing your tontine ideas and sharing this with us. We have a question from the audience. For the tontine, what about surviving spouses who would expect to receive a survivor benefit?
So the best way to explain this is that I was speaking to a very senior gentleman in Deutsche Bank recently, and he was saying that he expects to retire with a reasonably significant amount of capital. But the way he sees it is that he's going to take 25% of his retirement amount, put it into his tontine, 25% into his wife's tontine, and the remaining 50% he's going to split between his kids now so that they can spend that money to start a business or buy a house. So the reality is that the spouse, we would expect, and certainly will encourage people that the person that has accumulated pension income, if it's one working spouse, that they will divide that into an appropriate amount so that each of the spouses has their own individual tontine pension for life.
Thank you very much. I have another very nice question from the audience for you. Why did tontines disappear?
That is my favorite question, I think. Essentially, in Europe, the governments got so addicted to issuing tontines that it was burdening the states with a product that was too good for consumers. And eventually, over time, they realized that actually, if they just offered bonds, this is because tontines were invented and launched before the days of central banks, that if they just launched bonds instead, that they could get away with offering consumers much lower yields. And obviously, if the governments can save money, they did. In the US, after they were launched over there, the insurance companies launched the products. And there was such an overnight success that everybody went for broke to try and get as big as possible, as fast as possible, paying the highest commissions. And to pay these highest commissions, they started charging obscene levels of fees. And there was a huge investigation 40 years into the tontine pension industry. And they found out that the insurance companies back then, in the pre-regulation days, had been mismanaging the assets, tampering with the membership ledgers of the tontines to favor family members, and generally just behaving very badly. And there was a whole set of rules brought in the US, which prevented insurance companies from exploiting tontine members with fees that they didn't really need to be paying in the first place. And effectively, it destroyed the profitability of the tontine pension industry for the insurance companies. And as a result, they tended to switch back to selling annuities, which are a far more profitable product, not nearly as consumer friendly as a pure tontine, if managed correctly though.
All right, I see we have still 10 minutes, I think. Another question that came up is like, is there some kind of critical group size to run such a tontine?
Well, if we think about a situation that everybody else is already familiar with, if you reach retirement and you have 100% of your portfolio invested in a single asset, a single stock, that's a pretty risky bet that you're taking for your retirement. Even by just splitting that portfolio into two different assets, you've already now reduced your risk. And hopefully, if you're receiving the right advice, actually you're going to split that into hundreds, if not thousands of assets to protect yourself. The same sort of logic applies in the tontine. As soon as you pool your risk with one other person, you've reduced your risk. The more people you pool with, the more you're reducing that risk. But what we found is that the numbers for each cohort start working beautifully above 300, above 1,000. They don't get terribly better. But actually what we do is we tend to cap the pools at a size of 10,000. And that is purely for a gamification effect. We want Francesco to get himself down to the gym every morning and train as hard as possible and eat the right foods, because we want him to believe that he's going to be the one that lives to 105, 110, to get the best benefit out of the tontine. So, anything that we can do that maximizes better behavior of the tontine members, such as eating better, exercising more, or saving more, it's the behavioral science all contributes and drives that.
All right, thank you very much. At the end of your answer, there came really quite some some questions in. Maybe a nice question that for Francesco also in this respect. Who would regulate how the Tontine pool is invested, Francesco? Would it have any place in your PEOP proposal?
Well, about the investments, basically we are really following, we did follow in our reflection paper the approach that was already taken in part from the IOP directive and in part from the PEPP regulation. So basically, for example, when you think about investment options, we mentioned to have a limited number of investment options, say 6, just to really a little bit get inspiration from the PEPP regulation. 2 of those investment options would be either guaranteed on the capital, or anyway there would be a protection of the capital through risk mitigation techniques. The others, of course, would be more offered and up to the PEPP provider to be chosen by the potential users. And then I would say the main rules about investments would be the general ones about the prudential prudent person rules and so on. Then, like I said, anyway, it depends also on the sectoral legislation, because we know that an asset manager and an insurance company and the NIOP they could set up PEOPs, but they would be still regulated by their respective sectoral legislation. So that's exactly the same approach that has been taken for the PEPs, and we would not see a reason to create new rules on the top of that.
Another question which you answered in written form, but which I think is plenary also interesting with respect to the PEOP, is like in what way does a PEOP differ from a contract-based PEPP, so an employer-organized PEPP?
But I think I would say that the difference is the same as we can have between an IOP and a personal pension product. If we assume that an IOP is different, so basically an occupational pension is different from a personal pension product, we know that according, first of all, to the national legislations and the approach in the IOPs, the employer and the employee, they both contribute into this pension vehicle. We know that usually or very often the taxation, the treatment of the taxation between second pillar pensions and third pillar pension is different. And I would imagine, and I would even guess and hope that the PEOP would be considered and fiscally also as a second pillar pension, and so it would have a different fiscal treatment, I would say better than a third one. And also in terms of governance, we know that in some countries, I would say in France, in Italy, in Belgium, also of course very much in the Netherlands, in the Scandinavian countries, the governance and governing bodies sometimes provide for bilateral participation from workers and employers representatives. And that would be possible in a flexible structure like the PEOP. It would be possible that the governing bodies would accept the participation also of workers' representatives. It would not happen with a personal pension product. So I will see that there is, the PEOP should not destroy, let's say, the nature and the cultural background of the European occupational pensions. It should be an added value. It should not completely destroy the tradition and the way how those occupational pensions work in Europe. And I think on these features, we would be absolutely in line because the PEOP vehicle would be able to offer all these kind of solutions.
Well, thank you very much, Francesco, for highlighting these differences. I think we are slowly turning to the 1 hour session. I would like to finish this session by having a very thoughtful question for Dean. Are tontines not exacerbating the growing generation wealth gap and therefore socially questionable?
Well, actually, there's a couple of aspects to that. In Ireland, we'd call that a hospital pass question at the end, by the way, Sebastian. But actually, it's another great question. There's two aspects. Right now, there's a perception that, you know, my parents are going to live into old age. They're going to reduce their spending over time. There probably won't be any inflation. So, you know, they're not going to need to spend that much. And they're going to leave me 50, 60, 80% of their pension. But the reality, if you do the math, is that there's a high possibility that these parents are going to live another 30 years in retirement. Inflation does happen. So there's going to be cost increases. So the perception that there's a benefit, there's a huge pot of money that's waiting around when your parents pass away is completely false. The reality is what you're going to be left with is a liability. And in Europe, it's not, you know, it's a social problem that you've got to take care of your parents, of course. In the US, it's a legal problem because people that, if your parents are in a retirement home and they run out of money, the retirement home can keep them there and sue you to pay the fees of the retirement home. You know, that's not pleasant. The reality is that if you take care of your parents and they live a long time, you are going to be taking care of them when they run out of money. The tontine prevents that. It's a solution that provides for a risk-sharing mechanism that makes sure it doesn't happen. But if I can, there's one other aspect to that question. If you look at many pension systems that are out there, they're using the monies, and certainly in the US, the state pension schemes, the state occupational pension schemes, are using the money of workers today to support the pension payments of those that have retired already. That is ridiculous because it is completely unsustainable, and that is intergenerational theft. Because that money is just not going to be there to pay those younger workers when they retire. That is the case in 49 out of 50 states in the US. The one remaining state, the one state with a fully funded pension scheme is Wisconsin, and their state employee pension fund is the only one that's 100% fully funded. And why? Because they operate it like a tontine. So I think the questioner is right to bring up the subject of intergenerational theft or transfer, but actually tontines are the solution. They are the answer to prevent this, and it needs to be implemented as quickly as possible for the exact reasons that the person stated.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we slowly have to bring the conference to an end. Thank you very much for the audience for attending today. I hope that we could answer most of your questions. There's one last question, whether you could receive the presentations, at least of one of the speakers. I received confirmation that I'm allowed to send out the presentation in PDF form. If I receive after the conference another confirmation, then I'm happy to circulate these. You would need to circulate an email to my professional email address that can be found widely on the internet, I think. Then I'm happy to circulate that to you if I receive the permission. I think we also try to record the conference today. If that managed out well, it might also be possible that we are able to to bring it on the internet so that you can rewatch it or share it with anyone with whom you would like to share it. All right. Thank you very much, and have a good day all. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye
Bye bye.
bye.